seemed to be an implication in your, first of all, great talks, really. These are fantastic that we're having these at Yale. So I'm saying this with love. Exactly. Yeah. So the first question is, I just seem to get the implication that you were suggesting that exploratory research shouldn't be registered and that people should be around. And what I believe is that if you're going to do exploratory research, that's great, and we should be publishing exploratory research. We should declare it as exploratory research. We should register that we're doing exploratory research, and we should give a methods history of that, so that I think that sometimes people don't take a moment to say, what question am I actually trying to answer here? Because I'm just reflecting on my own group, where the time that they spent registering should be the time that they're spent organizing their ideas about what exactly am I doing. And the registration process shouldn't be burdensome beyond that, but it should enable them a pause to say, it's not just I've got all this data and let me just run around, but let me take a moment to say, if I'm really a scientist, then I should be able to at least define what I'm doing, even if that definition is discovery and exploration. But what question am I answering? I just wanted your response to that, because it just seemed as almost you said, well, this will slow them down and it discourages them. And then you said, then if they get negative results, it's all for naught, when actually the negative results should be informative. And so it's about, if you've shaped the question, hey, I did this, I didn't find anything, next person can build on that. What are your thoughts about that?
Great, so I'll start with the last point, which is, so there's a model, Platt had a science piece, I think 1964, entitled Strong Inference. And his argument was scientific fields advance most quickly when they pose sort of questions where an experiment can answer it, and either answer will be informative, right? So that is a model of science, and we would love to have, and we should encourage researchers to find those questions where any answer, whether it's a null or whatever the outcome of the experiment, it informs the community. Okay, that being said, the reality is it's often that's not the only model of scientific inference. And another model is one where another model is one where you're sort of taking a chance. So you might have a hypothesis that, so I'm speaking a lot to this last point, and then I'll come back to the first one. You have a hypothesis that I don't believe. Maybe 1% of the community believes your hypothesis. I wouldn't put money on it, but you're willing to put some time into it. And if you end up finding evidence supporting of it, then that's a huge contribution to science, because you've moved our beliefs, right? Our prior was strongly against it, you provided evidence. So I think a lot of work has that character. And for that reason, if you find evidence consistent with what the community already believed, it will be harder to publish and advance your career. It should absolutely be published somewhere. It should enter the record.
Preprints.
Yeah. But the poor grad student, who spent 3 months on that would have been better served if they had thought of their work more in an exploratory mode, because they were not in a position to theorize ex ante. So to clarify, I think of confirmatory versus exploratory more as a continuum. There's an edge where you have pure confirmatory research, where you have a pre-analysis plan, the code's all written up, and then we really know that the p-value has the properties, or the other test statistics have the properties that statistics says they should have. However, we're rarely even there with thorough pre-registration. There's often degrees of freedom, right? Researcher degrees of freedom, different ways you can analyze your data. And the more degrees of freedom you have, the more possibility there are that a p-value will be deflated, right? Because of selection for it, sort of interesting results. So I think my recommendation is, scholars should do exploratory analysis. They could do exploratory experiments rather than feeling obliged to make their one experiment the experiment. But there's real value to pre-registering all throughout the continuum. Just, I think, for what you're saying, to make it transparent what the mode of inference was that you were adopting.
I agree, actually, and I think it's just declaring this is what I'm doing, and then I want to give that person value for if it was worthwhile. Just one quick question on great talk about the policies, but what do we do when the policies really aren't being enforced? So, there's, even in the Obama administration, you FOIA information out of FDA, you're going to be waiting until you're old. They can talk about open government, but it's not really when it's coming to FOIA requests. And that, on some hands, we've made progress, on other hands, we really haven't, and I think it's not consistent. And with regard to, take example, what's going to go on PMI, the data holders, the healthcare institutions, are failing to comply with federal regulations in the HITECH Act 2009, and the government fails to push it forward. So I think it's a question how we are also advocating for the government not just to make the policies, but to enforce them so that people can respect them and ensure that they're being followed. Anyway,
So I don't know. I don't know. That's a. It's a. If to the extent to which is a question about what can be done. So I'm gonna let me say. Let me say two things here, both of which are unsatisfactory. The first is that one of the unsatisfactory things is that there were two parallel processes that emerged in the Obama administration. One was an open government and open data process run by one set of actors who were primarily technical people, and the other was a track that was essentially the FOIA track, which is essentially run by the lawyers. And that's one of the challenges. So I would frequently talk to stakeholders who would say, I want data set X, and I would say, don't call the FOIA people. Call the CIO, call the CTO, call the policy if you call the other side of the shop, you might be very lucky. So there's, so that's not fully an answer. The truth is that you gotta work the system. And what's happening, so I just literally submitted a grant proposal to a funder to say, we've been doing all this great training with all these chief innovation officers, chief technology officers, we have chief data scientists in places, they get it, but we're not teaching the lawyers. And by the way, it's one of the reasons I'm back here at my alma mater. On my home base I'm at the engineering school at NYU, but it's the lawyers who actually need to be brought along for the ride because they view themselves rightly as the safeguarders of due process, as the safeguarders of the public trust. But you know what? The world is moving on in terms of understanding openness. By the way, we just did a huge report on openness in the in the grant-making process, trying to push grant innovations. Lots of people on board, but the lawyers are like, huh, what? So we're catching them by surprise by not training those people and bringing them as part of the conversation. So the FDA is a very, as you know, mixed bag. I've been working with the FDA for a very, very long time. We made a lot of progress on opening up some data. When Josh was there, he and I worked on creating a transparency initiative FDA. We got some data out. Sadly, he left, and I left. Right now, we're working on another piece of things, which I'll just mention to put it on your radar screen, is one of the big problems we see in a lot of these places is data readiness. So, and it's like people don't get what to do with the data internal to government. So yeah, you have a dengue forecasting project at HHS, which is very sophisticated in terms of let's use predictive analytics to spot dengue. But I'm working with the NHS in England, a huge organization opening up a lot of its data. You know how many people they have who have the title of analyst or anything to do with data in their title? 150 people in an organization that has millions in it. So now there's a lot of talent that's hiding in plain sight, but you don't have people in decision-making roles who even begin to understand what the value is of data or how to use it. It's a very mixed bag. The Commerce Department here has 30 data scientists sitting at the top to the right of the secretary. Other agencies, they don't know from data. So it's partly, the FDA has its own very significant challenges in terms of the outside lobbying on it, but in part, there's a lot of work to be done culturally in terms of bringing the no machines, aka the lawyers and the procurement people, along for the ride, finding the people who are data savvy and putting them in key roles. So I think the talent is a big piece of it. So I think there's work that can be done. I would not, however, put a lot of money on the next administration, but we may be pleasantly surprised if we keep telling them that open data creates jobs that we can keep in the United States. Then who knows? Maybe we can have some successes. But I'd put my money on Mexico right now and Canada for open data. I don't mean and moving there, but but on open data, they're both better than we are at the moment.
Well, thank you for two very good presentations. My question is to Beth. In your experience in government, what is the current status, or did you ever have any conversations about making tax return data open? What's the status there? And second, when data are gathered through socioeconomic processes as opposed to mechanical, automatic processes, you concern yourself with the trade-off between openness of data and the quality of data?
So here's a
deterioration of the data?
of tax data. I have a great success story to report that will surprise you, I hope. So, not the story you're actually asking me about, but nonprofit tax return data. I know you want you want to know about individual taxes. Let me say on the individual tax return side, I think the question has to do with providing me back my own data. So it's the story of what Deb Estrin at Cornell Tech calls small data. If you're Nigel Shadbolt at Southampton, you call it my data. So processes of creating open data, my data that you give back to me, whether it's my healthcare record or my tax return. I would say there the IRS is at zero. Where we have made progress is on the nonprofit tax return front. So by law, nonprofits like Yale file their 990s with the government, with the federal level and the state level. And those tax returns by law are supposed to be made open. Now, the openness that they were providing previously was if you electronically filed your returns, the IRS would print them out, scan them back in, and then put that image file on a DVD, and once a year for $20,000, you could buy that DVD. I'm going to fast forward a lot of pain personally suffered to say that now you can download that data from the Amazon cloud. Hooray. The other part of that story, which is unfolding as we speak, is that the 12 states are working together to pilot a one-stop filing system. So instead of having to go to every single state in which you operate, you can go to one website, click, 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 file your returns, and then that data will be made automatically open. We, by the way, are making companies like GuideStar a little unhappy, and people whose business model, who are like the Apple iTunes of tax returns. But they're adjusting, and they'll live, and they'll provide value-added services that are not about selling the data. So there is a very happy news there. For the story about how we actually track tax data, I would point you to the work of a scholar named Julia Lane, an economist who's now moved to NYU from Chicago this year, who's done a lot of work on getting access, combining grants data, tax data, census data, so that we can actually track the value of government investment in science. So if the government gives $1 to Yale for science, we should be able to know, and tax return data is essential to that, what the downstream economic impact is of those investments in science. So that's, again, a story about data, the 50 shades of gray. It's not about open data, but about responsible access to data that we're making some progress on by virtue of having put some innovation roles into the IRS. I think there's a lot, and the last part of this story is commitments that are abroad, primarily around opening up corporate beneficial ownership data, which is partly coming from tax returns, which is knowing who's the real owner of a company. UK has made progress on this front, and other countries are trying to move forward on actually trying to tell us who owns the companies that we do business with, which is a huge other piece of work.
My question is about 1040.
Yeah, no.
What has been argued for about last 100 years?
Nope. No progress. Zero. Nothing to say. I mean, there's no, I mean, even access, the IRS has a statistical division that does pull samples of the tax data in order to do statistical work. I would say there's been no investment or progress on this front. There's a desire just to simplify the forms that we fill out and to create simpler, tax filing systems, or even to create a default like they have in other countries where the government automatically files my tax return and then I correct it. But we've made no progress on this. I don't know. Does anybody else have better news to report than? I thought I had happy news on some fronts, but.
One
more question. And I will be briefer in my response. My apologies.
Hi, how are you? Thank you very much for the chat. I'm Diego. I'm a graduate student of School of Forestry. I wanted to ask you about what are your thoughts about the openness of data from governments, but not only about the raw data they use for the policy making, but also about the methods they use, and how can organizations like the Open Data, Open Government Partnership can actually encourage this in not only the United States, but in other governments that might be also producing data, but at the same time getting to know how they actually use them to provide public policy.
Do you want us to know, political scientist? Do you want to add anything on this? I don't. So there are, in terms of things like, so there are efforts in sectors. So things like the Open Contracting Partnership are working to help standardize, to help governments know how to publish their data, their contracting data, and how to standardize that data. There are working groups that are more technical that are focused on things like data quality and data standards, including, there's a group that was stood up called the Open Data Institute out of the UK, which is co-chaired by Nigel Shadbolt and Sir Tim Berners-Lee. They do a bit of this work trying to help governments with their data practices. I think partly what's happening is a move spurred by hiring a White House level chief data scientist with trying to create a community of data scientists in government. So Commerce, for example, has been in the lead, and trying to provide then guidance and training for other agencies as you see people start to replicate, creating data savvy roles within agencies. But there really is a tremendous shortage. We see a tremendous shortage in the private sector of people with data science training. Everybody's clamoring for data scientists, so thank goodness Yale has this long list of things that's getting started, but to the extent to which we can encourage some of those people to go do work, or at least a tour of duty with the public sector, I think it's incredibly important because, right now we have to rely on the fact that we're putting out data that often is of extremely low quality, that's poorly collected, and we also don't know, forgetting about the fact that the methods that we use to analyze that data are still very nascent. I was last week at the launch at Imperial College of the new Center for the Mathematics of Precision Healthcare, which is simply about developing the mathematical models and methods that can be then applied to looking at healthcare data. It's a group of mathematicians working with clinicians. So I think we have a very long way to go, and we particularly have a long way to go because of the talent gap that we see in government. So pockets of work, and happy to share more by email. But let me just say that the big challenge is when it continues to be work that's done by, if it's done by diplomats, we don't get very far. And then one layer down are the policymakers, but we need those policymakers to be people who actually have some data science training. So next month we're going to launch a course, an online free MOOC called Data Analytical Thinking, aimed at mid-level government officials who don't know anything about data, precisely to help bring people along for the ride.
So let's thank Professors Noveck and Dafoe.